closely was Taiwan watching this meeting?
I think there's a constant assessment as to how it impacts, or whether or to what extent it impacts on Taiwan and the relationship between Beijing and Taipei.
My takeaway is that I'm getting more and more suspicious that there might not be a plan, and that's a big problem, because there needs to be a plan.
Hello and welcome to Connected. I'm Divya Gopalan. Journalists registered for China's biggest annual government meetings, called the Two Sessions, outnumbered the delegates this year. But how much did the Communist Party leadership really reveal about what's going on in the country? And what did this year's week-long meeting, known as the world's biggest legislative gathering, indicate about its future direction? Well, to discuss the key takeaways from this year's Two Sessions, we welcome Kerry Brown, a professor of Chinese Studies and director of the Lau Institute at King's College London, and Stephen Tan, managing director of International Policy Advisory Group here in Taipei. Thank you both so much for being part of the program. I want to start with you here, Stephen. How closely was Taiwan watching this meetings? And we'll go into specific details later, but what did it overall indicate to Taiwan about maybe bridging a gap with China?
Well, we're watching very closely here in Taipei. Every bit of signals, possible gestures before, during sessions, both in terms of the policy platforms and initiatives, or lack thereof, and the rhetorics, and also some of the phenomena, indicators, press conference or lack thereof, and then we're looking at this every moment at every aspect of it. And I think there's a constant assessment as to how it impacts, or whether or to what extent it impacts on Taiwan and the relationship between Beijing and Taipei.
So, Kerry, Stephen mentioned press conferences or lack thereof. Now, this is the first meeting to be fully open to the media since the pandemic. But the customary press conference by the Chinese premier, this time Li Jiang, was cancelled. What did that say to you?
I mean, the press conference has been part of the National People's Congress, I think, since the 80s. So it's a long-standing kind of tradition, I guess. It was just one of the few moments in the year when journalists, domestic and international, were able to get access of some sort to an elite leader. And although they had to ask prepared questions and it was highly choreographed, still, it was all that was really available. It's very rare that leaders have any interaction, certainly with the foreign media. I don't think Xi Jinping has given any interviews in his period in power with foreign media, I think, apart from the Russian state media. So, I mean, the symbolism of it was not great. The way it was announced was a little bit odd. Saying that this was not only for this year, but for future years, unless there was some compelling issue that needed to have a press conference. And also the fact that it was only 7 days, I think, this time, rather than usually it's a bit longer than that. It's a couple of weeks. So it seemed very businesslike. It seemed extremely kind of truncated, almost like they were as busy trying to get out of Beijing as they've been getting into it. I mean, a bit sort of strange. And particularly because in terms of trying to announce policy about the economy and other important issues, at the moment, China definitely, it doesn't feel that the outside world is listening to it. And it seemed to fluff the one occasion when probably the outside world might listen to it by not really trying to speak.
Well, Stephen, Xi Jinping also did not speak at this year's Two Sessions. I mean, I'm not talking about press conferences, but at the actual meetings. What does his silence say to you?
Well, I think Xi not speaking in the Two Sessions, along with the cancellation of the press conference at the end of the Two Sessions by the Premier Li Jiang, together speaks for itself that I think Beijing may or may not have an interest to even cosmetically communicate to the rest of the world on the key messages that it wishes to deliver. The cancellation no speech indicate to us that this is something that China has determined to go through its own course without even cosmetically communicating, the world through press conference or otherwise. This couples with the fact that normally within the CCP, the third central committee meeting will be held in the fall, the year before the two sessions. And it was postponed until now. It was either canceled or indefinitely postponed, at least not prior to the two sessions. Historically, CCP made its policy platforms and initiatives for throughout the year during the third central party committee meeting. Now, there's no such a meeting, and we don't know exactly what the direction that CCP is going to lead China going forward. There are lots of speculations. There are lots of conflicting messages. There are lots of emphasis on the security and then controlling the risks, whereas in other aspects, China still focus on or sending messages to continue to develop. So those conflicting messages floating around with the lack of transparency, as always, and even without a speech and without a press conference, and I think China has no intention to send a clear and loud messages to the rest of the world. And maybe this is because of its internal struggle or indecisive direction, or both. And I think it makes the world even harder to look into CCP and Beijing.
And Kerry, if we had to look at how, or what your read is on how China is going to go forward with its diplomacy with the rest of the world, what can we read into it? Is it does China just not care anymore what the rest of the world thinks? Are they going to be more isolationist? Or is it they're just forging their own path and hoping the rest of the world falls in line with what they want?
Well, the rest of the world isn't a unitary concept. I mean, there are several worlds now. And I mean, for sure, it's dialogue with the United States and the alliance system around the United States, which means Europe and to a certain extent Taiwan, but that's obviously a very different case, is already deeply conflicted. And I think a lot of the economic policy that was announced, the research and development and the kind of innovation policy that Li Qiang referred to in his government work report, is really about trying to create greater and greater autonomy for China, which might be possible, might not. So I think that world, certainly China is trying to not decouple from, that's not possible, but have clear water between it and them. But then there's, of course, another world, which is, Russia, the Middle East, Africa, Latin America, all very different. And China does have relations with those. So it's quite sort of segmented, quite fragmented. It's quite a kind of a world of zones, basically. And in each of those, China has a sort of different approach, a different audience, and people listening to it for different reasons. I mean, if you look at the Middle East and all of the issues there, the continuous issues, for sure, China has some kind of role there because of its investments, its relationship with Iran, the fact that it's clearly got some kind of voice to speak about the Israeli issues with, kind of the Palestinians and the Gaza, the attacks on Gaza. I mean, all of these things, China has some kind of role. But at the moment, it's not willing to spell that out. But it's definitely got different messages for different people. Obviously, in Europe and America, we hear this quite brittle message. But in other places, I think they just see a country that's willing to do business with them and not give them too much trouble over their own internal affairs, as long as it doesn't impact on China.
And again, as far as messages go, and you mentioned it, it has a very different message for Taiwan. So we asked Guermantes Lailari, a visiting scholar with Taiwan's Institute for National Defense and Security Research, about the likelihood of China making a move to take Taiwan. Here's his response.
I would take note of the fact that they say they're opposing Taiwan independence and external interference, repeating it. When dictators say things, people should take them seriously. And so I believe that Xi Jinping has set himself up for the situation where he has to take the responsibility during his rule or reign of taking over Taiwan, whether that's through peaceful or non-peaceful means. And the guy is not too young. So he has a limited amount of time to do that. What's the timeline? I say within Xi Jinping's lifetime. And based on his commitment to this concept of national rejuvenation, which cannot be done without reunification, according to him, I think the future is pretty clear. So that's in the statement, public statement, written in English for all viewers to read.
Stephen, there are all kinds of timelines being thrown around. What do you make of Lailari's assessment that if an annexation or an invasion were to happen, it would happen within Xi Jinping's lifetime?
Peaceful unification or unification is, at this moment, high on the agenda of CCP, no doubt about that. Whether or not this is highest in the pecking order, where this issue takes the highest priority, that remains to be seen. But I do agree that the issue for CCP, the issue on unification with China, with Taiwan, is something in the pipeline that is part of its so-called national rejuvenation. And I don't want to speculate on the particular time or time frame. Would this within Xi Jinping's tenure or his lifetime, or would this be in 3 year, 5 year, 10 year? What we're doing here in Taiwan collectively is to get ready and work with the like-minded countries to make sure that each and every day when Xi wakes up in the morning and tell himself that no, ready, it's not the right time to do that. And then we try to maintain the status quo. I think overall we have this sort of a national consensus here, so to speak, that we have to build up ourselves, and we have to be strong, but we don't want to speculate when and how it's going to happen and what happened and what would that be. So I think this is basically sort of the collective mentality, I think, for the 23.5 million people here in Taiwan that would be working and putting together.
Kerry, in the government work report delivered by the Premier Li Jiang at the opening of the NPC, the National People's Congress, China officially adopted tougher language against Taiwan. They didn't really mention peaceful unification or reunification, as they put it. What do you think are the implications for Taiwan? Does it feel like they're setting up for a tougher stance against Taiwan and perhaps more aggression in the coming years?
I mean, we have to remember that practically any move by China aggressively on Taiwan would carry enormous geopolitical and economic domestic consequences for China, which would, as of today, be catastrophic for everyone, not just for China, not just for Taiwan, but for everyone, particularly in America. That's the most important partner in this whole issue, apart from, of course, China and Taiwan. And America, which is hard to predict in many ways. I mean, no one knows what's going to happen in November. I think China's domestic and Taiwan policy is profoundly impacted by the fact that we're dealing with an America now, which is extremely volatile and may have a new president in November, or a president that, well, in fact, it's going to have a president that's had before. It just depends whether it's Trump or Biden. Biden would be continuation of business as normal, which would be manageable but not easy. Trump would be something very unknown because he's said very contradictory things on Taiwan. And, so it's extremely hard for anyone to know exactly what's going to happen. There are an increasing number of American politicians who are adventurous on Taiwan policy. Mike Pompeo went to Taiwan, I think, a few months ago and said that it should be recognized as, an independent country. I think Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister of Britain, went and said all equally strange things. I mean, this is not really helpful at a situation where Stephen, and I completely agree with him, said it's going to be maintaining the status quo. This is an issue which is not, if China maintains its position on sovereignty and identity, this is an issue which is not soluble and can't be solved. And so it is really crucial that it's just maintained as it is until someday when, it may well be that there's a resolution. I suspect that resolution will be within the next generation of leaders. Xi Jinping's mindset is that of an extremely conservative, populist, nationalist leader. It doesn't mean in the future that there's going to be leaders like that, but under his leadership, I can't really see a resolution being possible. And I think that's what the language at this National People's Congress kind of refers to, this hardline rhetoric because of the situation in the outside world. But it does not change the underlying structure of this issue, which is that it is irresolvable at the moment and should just be left alone.
Well, one thing we can say with, some certainty is some of these defense numbers. At this year's two sessions meetings, China raised its defense budget by over 7% from the previous year. Since Xi Jinping became president more than a decade ago, China's military spending has ballooned to more than $230 billion US. Now, that's more than double the $114 billion figure in 2013. But the US is still ahead as the world's highest defense spender. Let's listen in to Lailari again, who is also a retired US Air Force Foreign Area Officer. And he says the latest rise in China's defense budget was to be expected. Take a listen.
Over the last 5 years, for example, the average increase has been about a little more than 7% on average. So that's not a surprise. What is a surprise is the fact that the GDP growth is only 5%. So what it's communicating to the world is that no matter what the situation is in China, the PRC is going to continue to invest in defense at the rate it's been doing it for the last 20 plus years. In other words, at a very, very high rate. So let me give you a perspective. I looked up some data about the budget that Beijing is funding for its defense, and it's doubled its budget for defense in actual terms in the last 10 years. So 10 years ago, it was half of what it is today.
So, Stephen, the percentage rise in China's military spending has outpaced the annual domestic economic growth target under Xi. What do you read into that?
Well, let's not just look at the numbers. We should also look at the quality and the quantity and the willingness to pick up a fight. Whether or not CCP through PLA is ready to launch a war, not just against Taiwan, but the United States and other major powers in Indo-Pacific, South China Sea, North China Sea, Taiwan Strait. That remains to be seen, both in the near term and in the longer term. But if you look at the United States, yes, its defense budget has only increased by 1%, 2% out of the GDP, but its focus on Indo-Pacific has never been stronger than before. Then let's look at Taiwan. Under President Tsai, the administration has committed to increase its defense budget from now we're at the north of 2.5%. We're moving towards 3%. But again, numbers is number. But then we'll also look at the quality and whether, as I said, we as a community have a stronger sense of a nation to defend ourselves. And I'm not surprised again that the PLA's budget is increased, gradually 7%, maybe next year a couple of percentage. But then you still have to look back as the overall dynamics in the geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific region to see whether China interact with the neighboring countries, including South Korea, Japan, Philippines, or Taiwan.
So let's now move to the economy. Kerry, the 5% economic growth, that is the target. How realistic is that? And given that it is, it pales in comparison to previous targets of spectacular economic growth we saw, particularly over the past few years. Can China achieve this? Is it realistic?
Well, it's a soft target. I think it said it's an aspirational target, not like the somewhat harder targets that were set in the past. And also, I think the kind of aim of the government has been more about talking of quality of growth. I mean, more and more about quality of growth. So with the bounce back from the COVID pandemic last year, I think they got their over 5% growth target. This year, it is going to be ambitious, but I presume that they feel that there are sorts of areas of growth in the Chinese economy. They talked a lot about restoring consumer confidence. They didn't talk about the housing market, which surprised people because that's obviously where most concern is. 70% of household wealth is in property in China, in the housing market, which is double what it is elsewhere. So kind of that's a big worry. And the fact that there wasn't really a clear plan for that particular sector is kind of strange. And the world outside is still important for China. Investment has really fallen. It's going to be very, very tough for China to continue to do what it wants to do. But yeah, I mean, the era of high growth, that's long over. That was over a few years ago. It's now about trying to maintain decent and steady growth. And that too will be extremely hard.
And on that note, Anne Stevenson-Yang is the founder and research director of J Capital Research. She spoke to us from London on the state of the Chinese economy and the challenges it's facing. Take a listen.
Well, I just feel like it's evidence of paralysis for the Chinese government. It's exactly the same target as last year. Last year, they claimed that first of all, we're very skeptical that the economy really did grow at 5.2% last year. But setting that aside, they set a target of 3% for the deficit to GDP ratio, and they exceeded it, went to 3.8%. But this year, they set exactly the same target. So why is it that the weight of deflating debt would be any lesser this year than last year? At this point, the amount of money would be so enormous that China really can't take the risk of pouring in stimulus. You're getting sort of a one renminbi of GDP growth per 10 renminbi of input, and that's just too much.
Stephen, the reality is China may be over COVID, but its economy isn't. Taiwan has massive trade and economic relations with China. So what's Taiwan's view from here, given that as Kerry said, it's very unlikely we'll be seeing those years of double-digit growth again in the near future?
I myself, I'm not an economist per se, but let me say a few words about China setting up the 5% GDP growth as a target. The problem at this moment in China is it's not about the goals that you set up for the economic development. It's number one, lack of transparency. You can't see clearly, how the authorities make up the numbers, whether or not there is a trustworthy audit system, and whether or not the third parties, international community will be able to come in and look into the books. The second thing is that it's really lack of confidence. This both applies to the domestic consumers, the general populations, in spending their hard-earned saved dollars or yen, and also the lack of confidence in the international communities making investments and doing trade with China and in China. So all in all, it derived from the fact that the messages that CCP under Xi has been sending is so conflicting and so unclear.
We're running out of time here, but Kerry, I want to give you the last word here. What do you think is the key takeaway from this year's two sessions that can shed some light on Beijing's future direction, and be it, whatever made most of an impression for you, be it defense, economy, or just foreign policy?
Well, the key takeaway for me is there is no key takeaway. That's the thing that surprises me. I thought that there would be some kind of vision, because that's what we're waiting for, really, that there are clearly a lot of challenges at the moment. There are challenges economically, there are challenges in domestic politics. There's this bigger and bigger issue of whether there's going to be a succession plan for Xi Jinping and what's going to happen there. There's issues about how China's going to kind of continue a relationship with the United States. I mean, lots of things. And I thought the National People's Congress would be kind of a time when you would get a little bit of a clue of how things are going to go forward. But what worries me is that there was no solid kind of big, commitment to really anything. It was extremely businesslike, but I think there's nothing to really grab onto when you're kind of anxious and concerned about how China is in itself and how it's going to relate to the world, about what the positive vision is. And I think that that's ominous. It's worrying because this was the moment when it could have happened. There's an economic conference a bit later this year. Maybe that might be the time when we get a clearer plan. But at the moment, my takeaway is that I'm getting more and more suspicious that there might not be a plan, and that's a big problem, because there needs to be a plan.
And there you go. You've set us up very nicely for another conversation on this. But Stephen Tan, Kerry Brown, thank you both so much for your time and insight. And to our audience at home, if you'd like to join the conversation, do head over to our social media channels and leave us a comment there. Thank you for being with us today. Thank you for your company. Remember to stay informed, stay engaged, and stay connected.